O Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Take our minds and think through them. Take our mouths and speak through them. Take our hands and work through them, and take our hearts and set them on fire for Christ's sake. Amen. I was 13, junior high, social studies class, and we were watching a film, some documentary footage, Birmingham, Alabama. Police dogs attacking, school children chased and terrified, fire hoses turned on men, women, and worst of all, children like me. Well, not exactly like me, they were black. And to this day, when I see those images, I'm 13 again. My reactions watching that film rush back. I sobbed in class that day, and then again when I got home to talk to my parents. Most of all, I was furious. They lied to me, I said. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, they said. I assumed that was the end of it. No one told me any different. But these images were of the early 1960s, and I was alive. This wasn't ancient history. This was my lifetime. This wasn't the America I was taught about, and I felt betrayed. Now, my naivete was understandable. I mean, there were no black people in my neighborhood or school, although there were many other ethnic groups around. My parents raised me without any obvious prejudices. The only black people I experienced were strangers on the street or friendly islanders in the Caribbean where we vacationed every summer. No one around thought, until that moment, to let me know that my understanding of race relations was not accurate. So how was I to make sense of it all? Now, why speak of broken promises and disappointments? I mean, today's scriptures are all positive. They're full of promise. It's Gaudete, Rejoice Sunday. We just lit the candle of joy. Well, if modern scholars are right, the writer of this later chapter of Isaiah, it was written to a community returned from exile in Babylon, struggling to reestablish itself in Palestine. Their present circumstances were difficult, but their future was full of possibility. Perhaps they thought that God was giving them another chance, a new beginning, an infant nation. Their faithlessness and the sins of the past forgiven. Their rightful place restored. Their joy was rooted in the possibilities before them. But the verses in Isaiah leading up to this passage that we read today tell a very different story. The earlier verses of the previous chapter warn the reader of the inverse. It addresses those who did not join the community's worship and faithfulness in God. They shall starve. They shall go thirsty. They shall be put to shame, cry from sorrow, wail from anguish of spirit. They shall die. No mincing words there. The writer doesn't assert that all creation revels in the glowing promises of the final verses, but rather the writer makes a proclamation for a community that sees itself, or has seen itself as elect and favored by God, but understands that it has failed in the past. And it has experienced the tragedy as a result. So, They had to ask themselves, are we elect? And we should ask ourselves the same question. History shows that Jerusalem fell over and over and over again. Now Rome occupied Palestine, destroyed the temple, and again the people of Israel were scattered. And so it goes, not just for Israel, but for every nation and empire in the ages that followed, each seeing itself as elect, sanctioned, and blessed when it flourishes, and then despairing, wondering why when that wanes. And so it is with us, a relatively young nation, full of promise, rooted in the values of justice and freedom, opportunity and democracy. A nation that was a radical departure from the models around it at its founding, much as Israel was. Israel was just a collection of tribes working together for the common good. No kings, no empire, until it sought the security and the riches of the monarchical states which surrounded it. And then Israel lost sight of its values and fell in love with its success and power. And rather than being a light unto the world, it turned in on itself. We face that danger. Are we a beacon of democracy still? Do we light the way for justice? Do we forge new paths of opportunity for ourselves and others? Or do we turn in on ourselves? Live for ourselves alone. Let our arrogance blind us and assume that we prosper because we are chosen or deserving. You and I, are we deserving? I mean, did we create this nation, or is it just luck that we were born here? Our future is full of promise. But the litany of promises in Isaiah can seem just as distant today as it must have seemed back in the 6th century BC. Is Jerusalem a joy? Hard to make that argument at the moment. Do we all live long, healthy lives? The pandemic, recurring mass shootings, gun violence, deaths of despair due to drug, alcohol abuse, and suicide suggest otherwise. And does economic justice reign? The people who harvest our fruit, make our clothes, clean our homes, can't afford or are not allowed to live as our neighbors or educate and feed their families well. Is there peace among nations? Well, ask the people of Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Niger, countless other centers of war and conflict around the world. The answer to these questions is clearly no, or perhaps more accurately, not yet. But is it a betrayal? No. It is an opportunity, an invitation, and that's what we're called, and that's where we are called to find our joy, in the invitation and the opportunity. Paul's epistle today admonishes, don't despise the word of the prophets, but test everything. I mean, Paul was certainly familiar with all the promises and curses of the prophets. He was familiar with the disappointments and the sinfulness of his history and his present age. He understood that the prophets didn't proclaim what will be, but what can be, what is called to be. And nevertheless, he says, rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances. But how and why rejoice and give thanks when age to age humanity suffers and injustice reigns and brutality continues? Well, because one comes every year, inviting us into his life, inviting us to invite him into our lives, to cry out in the wilderness, prepare, to live his story and know the transforming power of God's love, especially in the midst of our suffering. Note that Paul says, give thanks in all circumstances, not for all circumstances. We're not asked to be joyful and grateful because God has solved all of our suffering and eliminated all our challenges, because God hasn't. And nor have we. But we are joyful and grateful because we are not alone in this story. As people of faith, we're subsumed in Jesus' story. And his story is as steady and reliable as the cycles of the year, even though it's full of mystery. And like the weather, it can catch us off guard, forcing us to reassess our present realities. And granted, it's not always a pretty story with a pretty ending. We try to make it so, especially this time of year. Birth narratives of Luke and Matthew come to mind, and of course we edit out the more brutal elements of their stories to keep ourselves and our children in the Christmas spirit. But our two Gospels, Mark and John, from which our Advent readings have been taken these past weeks, have no record of Jesus' birth. Their narratives start with the preparation for and Jesus' birth into ministry, baptism of the people and of Jesus himself. You see, for John and Mark, that is the significant beginning of Christ's story. His incarnation, his presence in the world is evidenced by his baptism. And today that presence is evidenced by our baptisms. We have no need to root Jesus' beginnings in his supernatural birth, as beautiful as that may be, because it's not his origin which is important, but his destiny. And it's not our origin that's important, but our destinies. We're invited through our baptisms to prepare for and participate in fulfilling God's possibilities. We're invited to create the new Jerusalem. We're invited to create a healthcare system that is accessible to all. We're invited to improve living conditions for the poor. We're invited to eliminate hunger, bigotry, oppression. We're invited to find new ways to resolve conflicts and promote peace. We are invited to invite the outsider into the center of our lives as Christ invites us into his. Yes, this is a new beginning for which we are preparing. Of course, the irony is that weeks after we celebrate this new beginning, we will enter a season where we're asked to prepare for an ending. Right? We're invited to invite suffering into our lives and let that transform us. And this juxtaposition of beginning and ending, of promise and suffering, of joy and pain, of peace and brutality, it's not only central to the Christian story, it is central to our human existence. So as we prepare for Christmas, we experience not only the excitement and the anticipation of festivities and presents and carols. We feel the stress of shopping, the anxiety of strained family relations. And some fight depression, some loneliness, some disappointment. But we're invited to take heart and rejoice because Christ is already present, already incarnate in our baptisms. Advent prepares us for it, Christmas affirms it, and Easter calls it into fruition. Our baptism calls us to action, not just for ourselves, not for the benefit of our own souls, but for the world. We are here to add our voices to that of John the Baptist, to cry out in the wilderness, prepare for the way of hope, the way of peace, the way of love, and the way of joy. Thanks be to God. Amen.